The year is 1937. Stalin's Great Purge is sweeping across the Soviet Union. More than 500,000 Soviet people have been arrested for being anti-Soviet. Boris Orman is a baker in the outskirts of Moscow, and he has a peculiar sense of humor. He was sitting together with his friends on a break and having tea together. And suddenly he thought, why not tell a joke? And he said it. So this was the joke. Stalin was out swimming and began drowning. A peasant who was passing by jumped into the water and saved him. Grateful, Stalin asked the peasant, "What reward would you like?" Recognizing Stalin, the terrified peasant replied, "Nothing, just please don't tell anyone that I saved you." There was a quiet laughter, and then everybody went back to work. By nightfall, however, the NKVD, the feared Soviet secret police, pounded on the Boris Orman's apartment door. The interrogation was brief and brutal, and within days he was convicted under the Article 5810 for anti-Soviet propaganda, sentenced to 10 years in a forced labor camp in the frozen wastes of Siberia. Now, this wasn't really an isolated case. In the USSR, laws extended into the most personal aspects of life. What people could say, how they worked, and even how they got married. Telling the wrong joke, arriving late to work, or even practicing martial arts could be enough to land you in prison. Today, these laws sound absurd, almost unimaginable, but for millions of Soviet citizens, they were terrifyingly real. In this video, I want to explore some of the most extreme and bizarre laws that governed life under Soviet rule, their ideological origins, the punishments they carried, and the way people found to survive under them. And we're gonna start with number one, of course, jokes. And I'm going to start that by actually telling a joke. So in the Soviet Union, there was a judge that exits the courtroom and he's laughing like a lot, like ha 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 ha. He couldn't really stop his laugh. And a colleague asks him, like, what's so really funny? Like, the judge replies that I've heard the funniest joke of my life ever. And the colleague says, okay, tell me. The judge says, I can't because I just sentenced someone 10 years for that. You know, the Soviet era joke perfectly captured the absurd reality of life under a regime where actual humor was criminalized. The Soviet government simply didn't discourage jokes. They viewed them as like existential threats to the entire communist system. A well-crafted punchline was considered as dangerous as a loaded gun. From the late 1920s to the Stalin's rule in 30s and 40s, humor became a matter of state security. Officially, jokes critical of Soviet leaders or policies were prosecuted under Article 5810 of the RSFSR, Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic Criminal Code. This infamous law targeted any speech or writing considered anti-Soviet agitation or propaganda. The NKVD, which is the Stalin secret police, maintained special departments dedicated to monitoring humor. They collected actual joke books as evidence. Informants in workplaces, apartment buildings, and even family gatherings could report humorous incidents to authorities. The punishments were quite severe and swift. As we talk, sentences typically ranged from 5 to 10 years of forced labor in the brutal conditions of the Siberian gulags. In particularly severe cases during the Great Terror of 37 and 38, joke tellers actually faced execution by firing squad. I think perhaps the most terrifying was that the crime extended beyond telling jokes. Even hearing a joke and not reporting it could result in imprisonment for failure to report counter-revolutionary activities. This created a society where even smiling at the wrong moment could be dangerous. Ironically, this brutal crackdown made humor even more powerful. In a system built on fear and control, telling political jokes became an act of quiet rebellion, a way to maintain humanity when other freedoms were stripped away. So humor was just one way the Soviet regime attempted to control personal lives. But what if I told you that the state didn't just control what you could say, it could also imprison you for simply being unemployed? And let's talk about the famous parasitism law. Point number 2, being unemployed. Here's another joke. A listener calls into Radio Yerevan, which is Soviet radio, and then asks that, is it true that Soviet Union people get paid for doing nothing? The Radio Yerevan replies that in principle, yes, but these positions, of doing nothing are already occupied by the government officials. Starting officially in 1961 under Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet Union introduced what became famously known as the parasitism law. This was formally called Article 209 of the RSFSR Criminal Code, targeting social parasites parasites or people without official state-approved employment. In Russian, it was called tuniatstva, which literally means parasitism. And the logic behind it was quite simple. I mean, the Soviet Union proudly claimed to have zero unemployment, believing that every citizen had to contribute directly to socialist economy. Anyone who is not employed was considered either lazy or suspicious or even dangerous. And the penalties were quite harsh. I mean, up to 5 years of forced labor, heavy fines, or imprisonment for not being employed. One of the most famous victims of this law was this young poet Joseph Brodsky in 1964. At just 24 years old, Brodsky was arrested in Leningrad, which is today St. Petersburg, for parasitism. Why? Because he didn't have a state-sanctioned job. He was actually a poet, and he was writing poetry, which the state did not consider as having a legitimate job. His trial transcripts actually survived, and you can even have a look at them today. And as a creative and as an artist myself, it is heartbreaking to read them. And I mean, let me share one particular one with you. So the judge asked, who recognized you to be a poet? Who put you in the ranks of poet? Brodsky replies, no one. And who put me in the ranks of humanity? The judge asked, did you study it? I mean, did you study poetry? How to be a poet? Did you attempt to finish an institute of higher learning where they, like prepare or teach? And Brodsky says that I did not think that it is given to one by education. By what then? The judge asks. Brodsky replies, in the atheist Republic of Soviet Union, that I think it is from God, this talent of writing poetry. I mean, despite international protest and advocacy from famous intellectuals abroad, Brodsky was actually sentenced to 5 years of forced labor in the remote Soviet region. The Soviet regime wanted to set an example that no one was exempt from this strict obligation to work under their supervision. Brodsky wasn't just alone. I mean, there were thousands, especially artists and writers and musicians and intellectuals who didn't fit nearly into the state-controlled employment system. They were prosecuted under this law. Many actually resorted to taking fake jobs, officially working as like boiler operators or cleaners or guards, just to avoid prosecution. The irony is that this law, designed to build a productive socialist society, often produced the opposite. I mean, it pushed creative individuals into meaningless and unproductive jobs and created an entire like underground economy where fake jobs were like bought and sold and traded just to be safe from prosecution. But, forced unemployment wasn't the only way the Soviets tried to control productivity. Imagine facing criminal charges simply because you arrived a few minutes late to work. That is exactly what happened in Stalin's USSR, and it's even crazier than you might think. Point number 3, being late. Okay, another joke. So 3 men find themselves in a Soviet prison. The first asks the second, why are you here? He replies that I was, 5 minutes late to work and I was arrested for sabotaging productivity. The first man nods and says, okay, well, I was 5 minutes early and I was accused of espionage. They both turn to the third man, who sighs and says, I arrived exactly on time, but they said that my watch is from the West. In 1940, as Stalin prepared the USSR for rapid industrialization during the World War II, he introduced a very notorious law to enforce strict labor discipline. It was officially known as the Decree on the Strengthening of Labor Discipline. Workers arriving just 20 minutes late would face severe punishments. Why? Well, because Stalin saw strict discipline as essential to industrializing rapidly, especially to support war efforts and, rapid industrialization in World War II. Workers' time literally belonged to the state, and if anybody is late, it's like stealing from the state, from the Soviet people. And this policy wasn't just empty propaganda. I mean, nearly 1 million people were punished under these absenteeism and lateness laws during the Stalinist period alone. Consequences include harsh fines and job loss and imprisonment, or even sentences in forced labor camps. But ironically, these harsh punishments didn't really work. I mean, they often led to decreased productivity. Workers became consumed by anxiety and morale was just down. Many devised clever schemes to appear punctual, like clocking in co-workers or sleeping at factories overnight just to not be late, or sometimes even faking paperwork to avoid punishment. It didn't really create an efficient workforce. These rigid policies created fear-driven inefficiencies and widespread corruption. Yeah, so next time you're panicking over if you're running late, remember that your life isn't on the line because of a delayed public transport. By the way, speaking of unexpected crimes, can you believe that simply learning karate was once enough to land you in jail in USSR? Yes. Point Point number 4, learning karate. Okay, here's another joke. So a Soviet citizen asks an official, is it permissible to practice karate in USSR? The Soviet official says that, okay, only if you promise not to use it against the state. Starting officially in 1981, the Soviet Union introduced a very remarkable law under 219 of the RSFSR Criminal Code, explicitly criminalizing karate instruction and training. The law defined karate as a violent practice incompatible with Soviet values. It claimed that it fostered aggression and cruelty and foreign capitalist ideas. But while Soviet Union approved sports like sambo or wrestling and boxing, they were allowed. Karate and similar martial arts, they were seemed culturally foreign, and they were explicitly banned just because of that, because they didn't agree with the Soviet culture. They came from somewhere foreign. And it was punishable, like actual punishable offense. You could face up to 5 years in prison and even confiscation of property. And its enforcement was actually properly done. I mean, secret police and local authorities regularly raided underground clubs operating secretly in parks or basements or apartments. Practitioners were labeled as foreign spies or antisocial elements. Official propaganda portrayed karate students as aggressive or anti-Soviet and dangerous. Perhaps one of the most famous cases was the arrest of Valery Gusev in 1981. He was a very prominent martial arts instructor known widely across Moscow. Ironically, Gusev taught kung fu, not even karate, but Soviet authorities actually made no distinction between karate and kung fu. He was arrested during a secret training session in a forested area near Moscow. The authorities actually labeled him as a dangerous criminal. It was written on his file that he's prone to escape and attack, an expert in karate. At his trial, prosecutors claimed Gusev promoted violence and capitalist ideology. Even though Gusev insisted that his practice focused purely on discipline and self-improvement, he was sentenced to 4 years in imprisonment for illegally karate training and an additional year for possession of a training sword, which was considered illegal and deadly. Gusev later described his trial in the newspaper. He gave interviews in 1989, and he said that it was a deliberate show trial and the Soviet authorities wanted to make an example of him to deter others. But despite severe penalties, karate and martial arts actually flourished underground, becoming symbols of individual resistance. Secret training sessions multiplied as young people defied the law and trying to meet covertly at night or deep in the forest or in basements. As I said, far from extinguishing karate, the ban actually increased its popularity, especially among Soviet youth who were trying to seek an identity that was separate from this Soviet idea of being a person. The irony is that labeling karate as dangerous and forbidden, it actually had the opposite effect. They made martial arts irresistible. It became, among other things, like joke became a symbol of quiet resistance and personal freedom and independence from strict state control. But banning karate might seem absurd, but I think it was probably not even the strangest example of Soviet intrusion into private life. Imagine the government dictating how your wedding should look. Welcome to marriage, Soviet style. Point number 5, Christian marriage. Yes, Christian marriage. The Communist Party viewed church weddings as like remnants of a bourgeois past, any symbol of religious superstition that had no place in a socialist society. Wedding rings and religious blessings and lavish feasts were condemned as unnecessary and ideologically backwards. And in cities, it worked. The old traditions faded very quickly. In the 1920s, some of the most radical experiments took place. They were called the Red Weddings. They were held in factory halls and Komsomol clubs. The Komsomol, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, are the communist youth clubs where young communists actually gathered to celebrate their comrades' marriage. There was no white dress or veil. Instead, the brides wore simple clothing, often their regular work attire. And instead of hymns, revolutionary songs were sung, and instead of champagne toasts, speeches about the virtues of socialist family were given. In fact, it is said that in the first decade after the revolution, wedding rings and white gowns nearly disappeared among the urban youth. They were seen as shamefully old-fashioned. By the 1930s, it was noted that hardly anyone wore a gold band. An observer wrote that an engagement ring on a Soviet woman's finger was like a rarity, viewed as a bourgeois relic. Now, even though I could not find much evidence from that time in terms of pictures, there is, however, only one photo that I could find. You can see that a bride, her head bowed, signs a document at the ZAG's office, which is the Soviet Population Registry entry office, and the official is watching her approvingly. There is no white dress, no veil, no celebration, only just like the strict paperwork and bureaucracy. You can see also the groom, who is dressed in a very simple embroidered clothing, which sits just in front of her. And behind them, you can see there is also another couple waiting for their turn. I think I want to highlight this very importantly, that this was not strictly a punishable offense, at least on paper, but it carried a very severe social and political risks. I mean, officials zealously enforced these new standards. Party members and Komsomol youth were strictly forbidden from participating in religious weddings. Even those people who secretly married in churches, like, they risked serious consequences. They could be public reprimands or expulsions from the party, or even being labeled like politically unreliable. The Communist Party took weddings so seriously that activists, like youth activists, even monitored how couples planned their ceremonies. In one recorded case from 1924, the Komsomol Central Committee explicitly encouraged young communists to avoid inviting their religious parents to their wedding, framing it as a way to break from the outdated family traditions. But, I mean, despite all the push, the cultural push, by the 1950s, some of the stricter ideological controls had softened. I mean, wedding rings slowly returned, the white dresses became more common again, particularly in rural areas where traditions always remained strong. But even then, religious ceremonies were discouraged. Civil registration at these zags remained the only legally recognized form of marriage, and any attempt to include religious rituals had to be done very, very quietly, away from the officials. In some Soviet republics, especially in the Central Asia, authorities continued to monitor weddings well into the 1970s and 80s. In Tajikistan, for example, officials reviewed wedding plans to ensure that they met socialist modesty standards. Extravagant and multi-day feasts were banned, and families were sometimes required to submit their plans for approval to the officials. But despite decades of government intervention, many couples found ways to hold on to tradition. Some would secretly arrange for a priest to bless their marriage after the official registration. Others hosted private celebrations where old customs reemerged, away from the eyes of the state. And when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, traditional weddings returned in full force. Church ceremonies and white gowns and wedding rings and religious blessings, all of which was suppressed for decades, again came back furiously. While the Soviet Union may have succeeded in reshaping marriage for a time, but it never truly erased the traditions that people held dear. I mean, no amount of state control could completely suppress the desire for ceremony, for ritual, for the deeply human need to mark life's milestones in a meaningful way. As absurd as these laws sound today, I mean, getting arrested for a joke, or forced labor for unemployment, and being imprisonment for being late, banning martial arts, or having your wedding regulated by the government, we tend to think of Soviet Union as something very distant, very strange, and long forgotten, something that was done by crazy people for the crazy people. But look closely and you'll realize that we have similar patterns that exist today as well. I mean, censorship and consequences for jokes, we see people facing backlash or even imprisonment in many parts of the world for what they say or share online. There are countries today that strictly monitor and control individuals based on their employment and social standing. And while a government official might not hand you a portrait of Marx at your wedding anymore, I mean, cultural and religious rituals again remain tightly controlled in many places worldwide. I mean, authorities deciding how and what people can celebrate or dress or even marry. The point is that these laws aren't just relics of the past, they're reminders of how easily a government's desire to control personal lives can resurface. So perhaps what makes Soviet example truly valuable isn't just remembering how absurd these rules were, but also recognizing when we see echoes of them in our own world today. And I can tell you, we do see them today in some form or the other. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.